All right, so in our last section of notes, we talked about the right to vote and how the right to vote was expanded to a couple of different groups of people. So we talked about how it expanded to women, African Americans, and individuals that were 18 years or older. So in this section of note, we're going to focus on voter qualifications, and you'll start to see how the states determine who can vote, and you'll also see that various qualifications they set are not very difficult to meet. All right, so what are the qualifications for voting and how have they changed over time? The basic requirements for voting are that you must be a U.S. citizen in most states, have established residency in that state for a certain period of time, normally 30 days, where you are casting your vote, and be at least 18 years of age. However, some states allow you to be younger than 18 years of age. The minimum voting age, minimum length of residency have both been lowered over time. The states have some leeway in shaping the details of the first two of these factors. They have almost no discretion with regard to the third one. All right, citizenship. In most states, foreign-born residents who have not become citizens cannot vote. Citizenship is up to each state to decide. States can also distinguish between native-born and naturalized citizens, requiring that voters become citizens of the state for a minimum period of time before being allowed to vote. With that said, there is nothing in the Constitution that says that aliens cannot vote. Therefore, each state can ultimately have the decision as to whether to allow them to vote or not. For example, Minnesota requires that a person must be an American citizen for 3 months before they can vote. Residency. A person must also be a legal resident of the state in which he or she votes. In the past, this meant that a person had to be a state resident for at least a year to vote in that state. Due to federal law and a Supreme Court ruling, most states now set no time requirement for legal residence or have cut it to 30 days or less. So why do states adopt residency requirements in the first place? Well, first and foremost was to keep political machines from bribing enough outsiders to affect the outcome of local elections. And again, this was a once very common practice, and we saw this with Tammany Hall during the Gilded Age, the boss of that political machine being Boss Tweed, and how he paid immigrants to vote in his favor, or vote for who he wanted to win, or give them jobs. And so this was a very corrupt system, and in hopes of forcing people to be residents for at least 30 days, or at least some amount of time, we hoped that political machines would be eliminated. To allow new voters at least some time to become familiar with candidates and issues in an election. Transients cannot vote in the state where they are living temporarily. Voters living outside their state, such as soldiers, can cast absentee ballots in their home state. Age. Under the 26th Amendment, the minimum voting age cannot be older than 18. Before the passage of this amendment, the minimum age has been 21 in most states. Some states allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary elections. Historically, younger voters have been less likely to vote than any other age group of eligible voters, and this is really reflected in legislation. What event was significant in lowering the voting age? The service of 18-year-olds in the Vietnam War helped mobilize public opinion to lower the voting age. The going saying was, old enough to fight, old enough to vote. The amendment was ratified more quickly than any other constitutional amendment. These men felt that if they were old enough to be drafted into war, they were old enough to vote. Voter registration in almost all states. One must be registered in order to vote. A prospect voter typically provides their age, name, place of birth, address, the length of residency to a registrar or county clerk who keeps a record of all eligible voters. 49 states, all except North Dakota, require that most or all voters be registered to vote. Again, registration is a procedure of voter identification intended to prevent fraudulent voting. It also gives election officials a list of those persons who are qualified to vote in an election. Also understand that voter Voters will remain registered unless or until he or she moves, dies, is convicted of a serious crime, or is committed to a mental institution. Also understand that here in the state of Ohio, if you are convicted of a felon and you were put in prison, you cannot vote during your time in prison. However, when you are released, you can re-register and you can vote. Voter registration can take place at rallies, fairs, school campuses, and other public places. In other democracies, voters must be registered by law. Only in the United States is it voluntary. The Motor Voter Act requires all states to let eligible citizens register when they apply for or renew a driver's license, provide voter registration by mail, make registration forms available at many state offices. This helps to ensure that everyone gets registered, or as many people as possible get registered. Therefore, they could vote. They want to reach all people of all classes, again, to ensure that everyone is given the opportunity to register and given the opportunity to vote. By 2000, 8 million persons had registered to vote as a direct result of the Motor Voter Law. So, should you need an ID to vote? In 2005, Indiana passed a law requiring voters to present photo ID to vote. In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that the law was constitutional and did not create a barrier to voting. This ruling allowed other states to add stronger ID requirements to election laws. Tests and taxes. Literacy tests for voting were once common but are no longer used. These tests are often aimed at denying African Americans the vote, with grandfather clauses allowing whites to vote without being tested. So basically with the grandfather clause, yet again, these laws exempted men from certain voting restrictions if they had voted or if they had ancestors, grandfathers who had voted prior to blacks being granted suffrage. African Americans then could not meet these qualifications. Some states, particularly in the South, also charged a poll tax to vote, and in 1964, the 24th Amendment banned the use of any voting taxes. So understand that if you were a white male and you couldn't pass the literacy test, because it was very difficult, and they made it difficult on purpose because they didn't want African Americans to pass it, but if you could not pass the literacy test, you didn't have enough money to pay the poll tax, and maybe you didn't even own land, you could still vote. Because with the grandfather clause, if you had an ancestor, which most white males did, then who had voted, then you could vote. And so this was a way in which to keep African Americans from voting, but to still allow uneducated white males to vote. Now, if you're an African American, you can pay the poll tax, you have land, and you are educated enough to pass a literacy test, you still can't vote. Because with the grandfather clause, you have to have an ancestor who had voted, and previous slaves, did not vote. And so they didn't have ancestors that had voted, and so, again, they could not vote. This was the system that was used after the 15th Amendment to keep them from voting. And it wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that African Americans could fully vote, because some of these barriers were eliminated. And then 1964 also had a big impact because it banned the poll tax, which was just another barrier that was keeping African Americans from voting. Persons denied the vote. Every state denies the vote to some people. Few states allow people found mentally incompetent to vote. Most states disqualify people convicted of serious crimes from voting, although it is often possible for convicted felons to regain their voting rights. And that is the case here in Ohio. Some states can also ban those dishonorably discharged from the armed forces from voting.